Well, here we are, Memorial Day weekend, and we are now in the 5th week of our study of the book Eye of the Storm by Reverend Dr. Gary Simmons. And if you were with us last week, you know that when last we left off, we had just talked about the 4 winds of conflict. Anybody remember what the 4 winds of conflict are? You didn't know there was going to be a pop quiz, did you? Anybody? Anybody know one of them? Okay. So we definitely need to get the little holders on the back of the seats with the little pencils and paper so you guys can take notes, right? That would be a smart thing for us to do. I've been looking for those. So the 4 winds of conflict are separation, misperception, competition. I'll remember the last one in a second. Yeah, right? Yeah, that's what happens to you. Competition and defensiveness. Thank you. Thank you, God. I needed that. And we talked not only about them, but also about that attribute of wholeness, which brings us into the eye of the storm, that wind that is separation, and that's communion. So we got 4 winds of conflict, and we also then have 4 attributes that we're going to finish talking about. Last week we talked about communion and how it kind of gets us out of separation. This week we are talking about that attribute, which is the attribute of wholeness that pulls us into the eye of the storm, that is misperception. And the attribute of wholeness we are talking about is principle, and that's principle L-E, not, A-L, right? In Unity, we talk a lot about God as principle, and I know it's like, but I thought God was love. Isn't God love? Don't we talk about God as love? Yes. This is something that goes all the way back to the, almost prehistoric times in the Jewish tribes, where they would talk about the pillars of the temple being the law and the love. The law being the principle that is God, the love being the love that God is, right? So even today, when we talk about God being both immanent and transcendent, can you see how those carry forward? That immanent God is the God that loves us, that we feel when we need it. Transcendent God being the God that kind of runs the universe. And when I talk about God and the universe, I don't want you to hear me saying them as being separate. This is me personally, okay? I define God as the universe, everything in it, all that lies behind it, and the laws by which it operates. That pretty much covers it for me. You may have your own definition of God, and if you do, right on, And if you're looking for one and that one doesn't work for you, maybe we can find another one some night when we're kicking ideas around at Christians with Questions, or, some Friday at lunch when we're doing metaphysical musings with the minister. Everything that we do is part of a journey. Even my own working definition is simply, my understanding as it is right now. And trust me, no human understanding right now really gets the allness of God. It's just simply too big. But because it's important to us, we strive to find a way of expressing our relationship with that thing. That thing that, keeps the stars in their orbits and, and still can be close enough to us to love us. But when we talk about God as principle, and we talk about those principles being things that can get us out of the storm, that can pull us back into that peaceful place, get us into that eye of the storm, there's a real reason for that. And the reason is that wind of misperception is simply part of us. No one among us has the ability to perceive everything. We are extremely limited. Our eyesight, the band of visible light, if you look at the entire electromagnetic spectrum, is extremely small. we only see a tiny fraction of what actually is. Our hearing, we again can only perceive a small slice of that bandwidth of sound. They say, dogs can hear things that we can't. They're there. Just because we can't hear them doesn't mean that they're not there. And for each one of us, our perception is colored by how we make sense of the world. So in a very real way, it is as if we are interpreting what is through several different filters. Our filter of our simple physical ability, our filter of our database, the things that we have to compare things to, because that's the way humans learn how to recognize things, is we compare them to things that we know. And then quite simply, our sort of internal operating system and central processor, kind of how smart are we? That entire system is what we use to perceive the world with. So it is no wonder that we get into judgment, which is essentially saying that seeing is believing. If I see something, that must be the way it is. And principle says, not necessarily. It ain't necessarily so. One of my favorite examples of this is probably 5 or 6 months ago, I was looking at some pictures from the Hubble telescope. And they had gotten some stuff from deep space, and there were a couple of these big gas pillars, that they're like pink, and they were really beautiful. And they were talking about the size of them. I mean, they were like, a couple of light years across. And then underneath the description, it said, oh, and by the way, these don't exist anymore. Because when we look just past those those giant pillars of gas, there's this supernova right behind them that's expanding. And in the amount of time, the millions of years it took for that light to get from those giant gas pillars that are light years across to the Earth, that supernova has expanded and destroyed them. So even though we see them, they're not there. The universe is filled with anomalies exactly like that. Just because we think something's there doesn't mean it was there. It's really in the past. At a very personal level, so many of the things that we see are not there. They're in our past. That thing I think I'm seeing in my wife or my husband or my parents or my kids, it's not right now. It's something that happened to me a long, long time ago. And I'm just seeing it again because I am laying it over those people with my perception, with my stuff, with my lens, with myself. And yet I go ahead and I start judging people based on that, even though that's not who they are. That's not what's really happening right now. I'm seeing something from the past that isn't really there anymore. Now, the flip side of seeing is believing is seeing. Now, we say that sometimes in Unity, that we believe things and then eventually they show up and we see them. But what Gary talks about is the believing is seeing as in an example of blind faith. And blind faith is also not particularly helpful because it can again lead to huge misperceptions. Most of us, when we hear the words blind faith, may think of the faith that we grew up in, right? The faith family that we grew up in, because they ask you to have blind faith. They ask you to kind of believe something without really having any evidence of it. And it may have been something that didn't make sense to you, which is why you're sitting in a Unity church this morning. And it's why I'm standing up here in a Unity church this morning, okay? Perfectly great example, but there are other more personal examples that still happen to us in our lives each and every day. Here's an example of blind faith. Oh, If I just love him or her or them enough, they'll change. Sound familiar to anyone? Right? He, she, or they will change after we're married. Right? They'll settle down. Yeah, Danella's laughing. Yeah, you get it. Yeah. Blind faith. It sometimes leads us down some pretty curious rabbit holes. Our ability to perceive is always going to be based at some level on what we're carrying around with us. It's not ever going to be accurate. So what we have to learn to do is to rely on principle. One last example that I thought really made a lot of sense, and I talked with Jamie about this before I said I was going to use it, but unbeknownst to many of us, she does not sign exactly what I say. Sometimes she makes stuff up because it's simply not possible sometimes to keep up, or I use theological or metaphysical terms that there's just not a sign for, and she may not know how to spell it. So she does her best to interpret the data that she has so someone else can perceive it. That's exactly like what our consciousness does. It does its best, and thank God we have it, and thank God we have Jamie, right? We're all right? Yeah. And we are all doing our best. But the thing that we have to remember to do is we have something that helps us when we get stuck. Just like she has some things that she can fall back on when she gets stuck. And the things that we rely on are our principles. Now in unity we talk a lot about the 5 basic unity principles, and the first one is really a big piece of this. Gary talks about the fact that there are essentially 2 kinds of principles. There are faith-based principles and love-based principles. And the faith-based principles are those principles we use that help us see God in everything. Well, unity's first principle is God is, right? God is in all things. God is all there is, right? God is all, God is good, there is only one, right? So that would be a faith-based principle. Then there are love-based principles, and the love-based principles are those ones that say, and we're all one. We are all one. We are one with our own inner selves. We are one with one another, and we are one with God. And when we operate from those principles, we can lay aside what we think we see and what we think we know and still be able to operate. And not only to operate, but to operate at a level of being higher than we may have thought possible. It's interesting, as I was doing some of my research for this, I found an old tract. This is from probably about 100 years ago. And it was during the First World War. Funny I did this Memorial Day weekend, isn't it? And this is from a tract that Unity published about 100 years ago called Bulletproof Soldiers. And this is from the teaching by a truth teacher, I can say that word, named Frederick Rawson. And he was actually a British guy who was using some of the same ideas that we do. And essentially what he was teaching troops before they went into the field, into the trenches in World War I, was to see God. Not to look at the horrific stuff going on around them. Not to worry about getting hurt. Not to even see themselves whole, but to look for God. And, there are numerous examples that he cites here. Now, some of them, there may be a little hyperbole involved. All right? But he says, Captain so-and-so will be here tomorrow. After taking of a wood, there were 500 yards of no man's land to be crossed, and that meant that's a big place where there's no cover, no place to hide from getting shot at. Okay? Our troops could not get across. Then Captain so-and-so, who practices this method of prayer, treated them for an hour. That means he worked with them and prayed with them and told them to see God in everything. Treated them for an hour before they started, and not a man was knocked out. He was the only officer left out of 80 in his brigade. He simply held on to the fact that man is spiritual and perfect and could not be touched. A bullet fired from a revolver only 5 yards away hit him over the chest, tore his shirt, and went out the shoulder, but it never penetrated his chest. He was frequently in a hail of shells and bullets which did not touch him. And he goes on and describes another colonel and several other different things. But then as we get further down in this is, I think, the thing that is really pertinent to us today, unless you are going to go into combat. And what he says is that nearly all other kinds of practitioners think of the spiritual reality of man. So in other words, they go back to that thing, I'm all good and I'm spiritual and nothing's going to hurt me. He says, I don't. I think of the perfection of God and of heaven. And then he goes on down and says, when you think good, you must not think so-called good. If you have a headache, don't think a lie that you have no headache, but think of absolute good, which is of God and heaven. That's principle. Thinking of the absolute good of God and the absolute presence of the kingdom of heaven, which is right here, right now, not someplace, far off in the sky after we're gone. Interesting side note. Some of not only his work, but some other folks' work inspired this little guy. In Unity, there have been times when I have run up against folks who don't understand how I can be in the Army and be a Unity minister. We've even had people leave this church, which is a shame. But you need to follow your integrity and go where you're called to go. But back in the day, this is called A Truth Student with the Soldiers, and it's the story of a couple sisters who were stranded in France when they were evacuating France in the First World War. And they started ministering to soldiers that had been evacuated to some of the hospitals in Paris. And they were teaching them truth principles to help with their pain, with their healing, and with their fears, especially those guys that were going to have to go back out to the front. So Unity took their story and they created it in this little booklet, which they bound it specially. It's bound in khaki, and it's sewn. It's not glued, and it's designed for soldiers to be able to carry it in their pockets, and even if it gets wet, it won't fall apart. And this was a gift to me from my old senior minister in Orlando, Reverend Alice Anderson. She had a copy of this that she had found, and she gave this to me when I went off to ministerial school. Unity also published 2 other works in binding like this, Christian Healing and Lessons in Truth. And they made them available to soldiers to be able to read and to help themselves through things that are horrific beyond imagining. Some people have wondered why, when we got here, we stopped doing the prayer for protection, which most Unity churches do at the end of the service. The reason is I find it out of place here, and that's because the prayer for protection was written for soldiers going into combat. And if any of you are going to go into combat, I will cheerfully pray the prayer for protection with you. And if I'm ever called to go into combat, I certainly hope you'll say it for me. But what this points to is a very real use of principle in the worst possible conditions. So if nobody's actually shooting bullets at you, if no one's actually dropping artillery on your head, if nobody is coming at you with bayonets affixed, When somebody starts to get in your business, can you maybe use principle a little? See the love that God is somewhere in that circumstance. See that they really truly are part of all that is, and you are as well. Even though you may not agree, even though they may have hurt you, even though they may have insulted you, that maybe it's really not about you, it's about them. It's about something missing in them. And as Gary suggests, maybe you can take a look inside and say, gee, what is it that's missing in me? What is it that I don't have right now that if I had that, this wouldn't trigger me? I'd be completely okay with them being the way they are right now. When we can do that, we're living from principle instead of living from misperception. And that is what this particular attribute of wholeness is all about. So last week's attribute was communion. We really are in common union. We are one. And we really can live by principle because principles always work. We may not see it fulfilled in our lifetime. We may believe, and it may not come to us this lifetime. That does not mean it doesn't work. The universe is a big place, as we saw in the example with the gas clouds and the supernova. Sometimes it takes a long time for the truth to arrive, but arrive it will. So this week, if conflict shows up, my invitation to you is to ask yourself, am I in judgment? Am I exercising blind faith? And is there a principle here I can believe that will help me? That somehow, some way, God is in this situation too, and that somehow, some way, I can love these people because a part of them they may not even know loves me, or we wouldn't be here together on this earth calling each other's souls higher. Have a wonderful rest of your Memorial Day weekend.